Until the mid-1990s, AOL had a near monopoly in the sphere of commercial online multiplayer, with Neverwinter Nights being uncontested as a graphical online role-playing game, and the only other competition in the private sector coming from obscure console peripherals like X-Band. That all began to change around 1996. Not only were more online games like Diablo and StarCraft entering development, but ambitious developers were seeking to create more expansive virtual worlds that would surpass Neverwinter, culminating in the birth of the first massively multiplayer online role-playing games, and in the two competing schools of thought that would go on to drive their design. While the series has gradually become more obscure over time, in the late 80s and early 90s, the Ultima games were among the defining single-player role-playing games of the Western canon, both presenting and challenging the combat-focused nature of the genre by building the player's objectives around a moral system, and attempting open-world forms of progression long before the subject of linearity became something debated in the popular press. Series creator Richard Garriott sought to expand the premise with an interconnected online world that emphasized free-form progression in any direction the player wanted, whether that was through combat, burglary, or even making a humble living as a blacksmith. The result of his designs was Ultima Online, the game that coined the term MMORPG. Ultima Online took place from an isometric perspective using two-dimensional sprites, and unlike the Deku mods it was contemporary to, it did not impress any real sense of direction on the player. There were no traditional classes, or raids, or Holy Trinity. Instead, any character could raise their stats in anything simply by doing that activity, theoretically being able to max out their abilities in every category, but in practice needing to collaborate with other specialized characters because no one had all the time in the world. They could live either as a law-abiding blue player or a murderous red player, someone who has killed 5 or more blue players. Murderers in Ultima Online were instantly recognizable to others because of their red usernames, but if they waited 40 hours, one of their murders would be purged from their record, and they could eventually become blue again, most likely to facilitate another murder. Ultima Online had features beyond just killing. If a player was rich enough, they could buy a house and put it absolutely anywhere on the map. They could smelt ingots to forge into equipment to use, sell, or trade. They could pick the pockets of other players and use magic to enchant monsters to become their pets. The economy was entirely player-driven and player-directed. This do-anything environment is best summed up by one particularly infamous event that took place during the game's open beta test in August 1997. As part of a stress test for the servers, Richard Garriott was to travel from town to town delivering a public in-game address as his own character, Lord British. Lord British was to deliver the address from the safety of a balcony, would be protected by an escort of guards that would catch any illegal activity, and had a special invulnerability cheat active that protected his character from harm. However, shortly before the address, the Ultima Online server had been reset. Unbeknownst to Garriott, resetting the server also reset the invulnerability flag on his character. Believing he was still invincible, he did not speak the chat command to toggle the invulnerability on, and after seeing how many players were logged in, he chose to dispel the guards to reduce the server load. As he was giving his speech, a 23-year-old thief named Rains was making his way through the crowd, alongside his friend Helios. Both he and Helios were members of the Ravens of Fate, a 24-person guild devoted to keeping the balance of power in the world of Ultima Online. The Ravens' philosophy was that in a world without conflict and war there would be only oppression, one group oppressing another. And to the Ravens, Lord British was the very embodiment of that oppression, someone who created a world just so he could rule over it. To that end, their goal was to create eternal war in the Kingdom of Britannia, and assassinating its king would be the cornerstone of that forever war. Seeing that there were no guards around, Rains used his pickpocketing skill to pull items out of the inventories of the other players in the crowd, until by chance he stumbled on a Firefield scroll, and immediately cast it on the king. At first, Lord British laughed at the attempt, and then he burst into flames. Rains bolted from the scene. Lord British's vassal, Blackthorn, played by Ultima Online project director Star Long, summoned 4 demons into the castle to kill the assassin and slaughter dozens of players in the process, but had no idea who cast the spell, and failed to catch the thief before he got away. Rains was later identified and given a lifetime ban from Ultima Online, but it didn't matter what was done to him. He had already won, and the players of Ultima Online lived in the Raven's world now. In the years that followed, countless legendary cons, heists, and murders took place, whether through players using invisibility to make their text appear as if it was coming from somewhere else to trick players into going off on a fake quest that would end in them being ambushed and robbed, or logging out in an area that someone later built over and logging back in to rob their house from the inside. Ultima Online was like a Hobbesian state of nature made real, a war of every man against every man, not just red against blue, but red against red and gray against gray, as many players resorted to lesser crimes and stopped short of actually killing many people. Not everybody loved the mayhem and chaos that characterized Ultima Online. In particular, the developers themselves felt this wasn't the kind of play they wanted to encourage, and many players were pushing for player killing to be out of the game entirely, just as they'd been pushing in Neverwinter. Ultimately, Origin Systems came to a compromise, both to address these problems and the intense server load, as the servers were beyond capacity from the beginning, drawing more than 100,000 subscribers in 6 months when they were anticipating closer to 15,000. Origins came up with two solutions to this. The first was one that was already in the works when the game launched. They would reduce the strain by splitting the game into multiple servers, branching off from the original server, Eastern, into the Pacific, Great Lakes, Lake Superior, Baja, Chesapeake, Napa Valley, Sonoma, and Catskills servers, each of which were named after either the time zone or specific North American geography their server populations catered to. Each server contained their own copy of the Ultima Online world. To explain these in terms of the Ultima universe's lore, Origins came up with the concept of shards, stating that Mondain, the original antagonist of Ultima 1, had tried to contain the essence of the world in an artifact called the Gem of Immortality, and when the protagonist of Ultima 1 shattered it, this fractured the world itself into a multiverse, with each shard of the gem containing a refracted copy of the original. The second solution, introduced in May 2000 alongside the game's Renaissance expansion, was to create multiple worlds with different rules, with the main world, Felica, obeying the original rules and a secondary world called Trammel disabling all non-consensual player versus player attacks. These were massive changes for the game. Although Ultima Online spent less than 10 months out of its entire 25-year history as a single-server game, the practice of sharding quickly came under fire for breaking up the unified player base. If you encountered someone in real life who played Ultima Online, the broken-up servers made it increasingly likely you couldn't play together, because your characters are made on different shards, and news of a player's activities on one server generally wouldn't carry to another. There could be no more legendary players like Reigns if the population was divided among a dozen or more shards. At the same time, Trammel was both a reason for less combative players to subscribe without fear of all their work being undone by a murderer, and seen as a betrayal of the game's core values by hardcore Ultima players. Balancing the interests of both groups to the point that they could each continue their subscriptions satisfied was an impossible task. The influence of Ultima Online is hard to overstate. It was actually preceded by two earlier MMOs, Meridian 59 and The Realm Online, but these were not as widely known, and as a result they didn't have as great an impact on the formative genre. The key to Ultima's success was in its massively modifier, that you could be in a world with hundreds of other players simultaneously, doing anything you could set your mind to. This inspired a number of imitators, including the British MMO RuneScape and the Japanese Dark Eyes and Lifestorm. Its influence extended well outside the genre, partially inspiring Kawahara Reki's famous Sword Art Online novels, which were originally published on the internet in 2002 after he went over the page limit for a novel writing contest. Kawahara was a hardcore gamer in his own right who often played Western MMOs even when they weren't available in Japanese, and his Sword Art Online imagined a near-future virtual reality MMORPG with a skill growth and morality system much like Ultima's, divided into outlaw orange players and lawful green players. Many of Kawahara's minor antagonists simply behaved like Ultima Online outlaws given access to a more realistic world, and he used the opportunity to examine the extremes that kind of player would go to inside his central premise of players being held hostage in a virtual reality, unable to log out. But for all its influence and open-endedness, Ultima Online's heyday was short-lived. The game's population peaked at 250,000 subscribers in 2003, but by that time it was already small potatoes compared to the absolute most populous titles in the genre. While the game is still around today, the forces that put this type of game design to rest were already in motion in 1996, and 3 years later, the world first tasted the addictive power of EverQuest.